Welcome to Environmental Fridays. It is Personal, Season 2. You can learn more about our topics and speakers by joining our Environmental Fridays Facebook group. This series is brought to you by Best Early, the Benton Spirit Community Newspaper, Andrews University Community Engagement Council, GC Scored, Every Piece Matters. Introducing your host, Dr. Desmond Hartwell Murray, and this week's co-host, Professor Ladina Kaihai, Hannah Castillo. This week on Environmental Fridays, we'll be hearing from Emma Suvacarov.
So we want to again welcome everyone to our Environmental Fridays. It is personal. This is Season 2 of Environmental Fridays. Today we're going to do something special. I'm not going to have a long introduction myself, but we have a friend of mine who has been a regular as well. Her name is Padmani Ramatar. She is a biology and environmental science teacher, sixth form that translates to basically high school here in the US. She teaches at Bishop Anstey and Trinity College East in Trinidad and Tobago. And the most important thing for me, actually, which is being very selfish, but nevertheless, is that she is an organic chemist. She is currently doing her master's in organic chemistry at the University of the West Indies. And that is so cool from my perspective, anyway. She already has a chemistry degree and biology degree from that same university. And she's going to talk to us about a project that she initiated and organized. Students, the young people here taking upon themselves and being environmentally concerned, conscious, and doing something about it. So we wanted to highlight that today. What I will do next is, again, in the interest of time, skip some of my preliminary stuff, and I'll go to our co-host, Professor Ladana Kanhai, to introduce our speaker for today.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me properly? Yes? Okay, great. Yes. All right, so my name is Ladina Kanhai. I am based at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad. And I'm really delighted this morning to have the opportunity to introduce to you our speaker. So today we'll be hearing from Emma Suvacarov. So Emma is currently a biochemistry major at Andrews University, and she's completing her 4th year. And Emma is from Illinois, and she attended Hinsdale Adventist Academy High School. So at Hinsdale, she was involved in the class office, sports, and she served as the yearbook editor. Currently, at Andrews University, she's a member of the Lady Cardinals soccer team. She serves as the vice president of the chemistry club, and she helps take care of the bunnies at the Agriculture Center. Emma is currently conducting research with Dr. Hayes on method development for hair analysis for heavy metals. After graduation, Emma hopes to attend veterinary school and get a master's degree in environmental science or public health. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Emma to you. And this morning we'll be hearing from her as she speaks to us about the issue of microplastics in the ocean. So Emma, whenever you are ready.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be giving a presentation I gave last semester for a class called Chem 418. It's kind of our senior chemistry communications class. And so I chose the topic about microplastics in the ocean. And to give a more chemistry standpoint, I chose how certain chemicals or heavy metals adsorb to these microplastics, and these microplastics serve as vectors for contamination. So I'm not really an expert on the topic, but it's definitely something I'm interested in. I'm always been interested in environmental science, public health, and the ocean. So I'm just going to share kind of what I found through the compilation of a couple of different scientific articles. So an outline on the presentation, I'm going to give a brief history on plastics, what started our use and obsession with plastics, what are microplastics, because they are different from regular plastics in structure a little bit, how they end up in the ocean, how do different materials adsorb to microplastics, and adsorption versus absorption. The adsorption is with a D, and then the factors that affect environmental or polymer dependent based on the plastic type. And then most specifically, I focus on trace metal adsorption. And then why is understanding the ways these chemicals interact with the plastic important, ecosystem implication for animals and how they bioaccumulate in the food chain, and then the environmental threats and some future work. So a brief history on plastics. So when plastics were invented in the 1860s, the first synthetic polymer was created by treating cellulose with camphor, which is kind of this waxy substance from the camphor tree. And it was done because they wanted a replacement for ivory, something strong and durable. And this created a whole new world because they were no longer restrained by simply like wood or products like that. The possibilities seemed endless to them because they could create new materials with this plastic. And then in 1907, Bakelite was created, and it was the first fully synthetic plastic. And this was great for electronics because it was a great insulator. And in the 40s, around World War II, nylon, so like what we find in fabrics, was created. And this was perfect for World War II, specifically parachutes and a lot of other things. And then from the environmental standpoint, plastic debris was first observed in our ocean in the 60s. Rachel Carlson published some studies on pollution, and that's kind of when the whole movement started. And then in the 80s, we began our recycling initiative, but unfortunately, only 9% of plastic is still recycled to this day. So here's some pictures of microplastics. You see it's kind of smaller. There's different shapes. There's this kind of string, probably from fabrics. And this picture on the right is from National Geographic, from microplastics collected off the coast of Hawaii. And we see a fish got in there. And then here's through some mesh just to see the size. So what is a microplastic? A microplastic is any plastic 1 micrometer to 5 millimeters in length. So kind of think the tip of a pencil eraser to kind of half the size of a grain of rice. And some of the most common plastics include polyethylene, polypropylene, and commonly heard polyester, which is in our clothing and washcloths. And an important thing about microplastics is that there are primary versus secondary microplastics. And this infographic on the right, I found really interesting. It shows the percentage of the source for microplastics. So I was really surprised that synthetic textiles such as clothing seemed to be the most prevalent source of microplastics. I thought that was really surprising. I thought it was going to be something like personal care products because that was a big thing in the news a couple years ago. And then car tires also, just the shedding of car tires has a great contribution to the microplastics in the ocean. So primary microplastics, they are made in production, either remnants from 3D printing. When we make these plastic products, the tiny plastics that make them up, they're called nurdles. And then synthetic textiles from the fashion industry. So your clothing, when you wash your clothing, these small fibers, they wash out, they end up in your washing machine, and then the wastewater treatment facilities don't capture them because the threads and fragments are too small. And then another thing I wanted to mention, because this is something I heard about in the news, maybe back in 2015 when I was growing up, is the beauty products containing microbeads, such as lipstick, toothpaste, face wash. I remember there was exfoliating face wash with these small like spheres, and those were one-use products. And when you would wash them down the drain, they would most likely end up in the ocean because, again, they can't be captured through the wastewater treatment facilities. And so here's just some news articles. This was a big thing in 2015. The FDA passed an act saying that these one-use microplastics could no longer be used in face wash and toothpaste. So they moved away from these small spherical microplastics. And that's interesting because as shown in the infographic earlier, the microplastics from the beauty industry only contributed to about 3% of the ocean's microplastics, but it's good they were able to kind of fix this problem, even though it isn't the biggest contributor to oceanic microplastics. But clothing was a really big issue, specifically synthetic clothing, because that's what's made, it's essentially plastic. So synthetic fabrics make up about 60% of the material worldwide that we use in our clothes. It's cheap, comfortable, arguably. I know some people are allergic, and it was produced in the 40s and it's had growing use since then. And these synthetic fabrics are actually made of these tiny fibers less than 5 millimeters in length. And they say, based on some studies, that a single load of laundry can release hundreds of thousands of fibers into the water supply. So kind of think about it when you're drying your clothes and you see the lint collect and you scoop that out. Essentially, when you wash your clothes, not lint, but the material from your synthetic clothes is being washed and it collects and then it goes down the drain and it can't be captured by these wastewater treatment facilities. And so this was really shocking to me. They said 793 pounds per year of individual teeny tiny plastic shards, like per person, is released per the average person. And then this infographic on the right, it shows the estimated fibers released from the different types of fabrics. So acrylic, that's kind of our more heavy duty winter stuff, gloves, mittens, sweaters. And then we see polyester, which is very common. And then when it's combined with something natural, it sheds less. So this is a really big issue. Like the fashion industry, the clothing industry contributes to our microplastic abundance in the oceans. And so now for secondary microplastics. These result from the breakdown of larger plastic items such as plastic water bottles, plastic bags, and this is mainly through the UV radiation and waves. And then the fishing industry, I know that was another hot topic from Seaspiracy, the documentary on Netflix, makes up an estimated 10% of our ocean's plastics through nets and ropes, and those have a different kind of composition than we see like the sphere microbeads. So I wanted to show this because I think for adsorption, the shapes play a big role. Here we see something like perfectly spherical. Here we see kind of something flat, probably primary made in production. Up in the right-hand corner, we see something that was fragmented. It could have been a coating. And then in the bottom, we see kind of more of the fibers. And that pink one in the middle definitely looks like something acrylic or polyester that washed off from a sweater. So these are all the different shapes and roles microplastics can take on, and then they end up in the ocean, either to absorb or just be ingested as they are. So now for some specific statistics on microplastics in the ocean. There's about 15 to 51 trillion pieces of microplastics estimated to be in the ocean. There's no specific methodology yet for accounting for this, so that's why it's such a wide range. And then every day, around 8 million pieces of plastic make their way into our oceans. And these plastic microbeads, they're estimated to be 1 million times more toxic than the seawater around them due to them absorbing either heavy metals or organic compounds, pesticides, And they're especially harmful to filter feeders because these animals, they're filtering out the water and they think this little piece of plastic might be a food or might be something from another animal. And it's also important to note that most microplastics sink, which is a reason it is very difficult to count them. A lot of studies are done on like coastlines and in the sediment to kind of try and combat that issue. And so I just wanted to show this. This is a really good infographic by National Geographic. It's not specific to microplastics, but it kind of shows plastic accumulations in the ocean. And we see the purple regions, those are kind of where the plastic accumulates, and it's due to the gyres. So from what I can understand, that's these plastics accumulate in these areas because there's a very strong current surrounding it, but in the middle, it's almost like this desert. And so the plastic just accumulates there because there's no current to get it out, but the current pushes it in. And you can see off the coast of California and by Hawaii, that's where what we would know as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a floating patch of plastic, but still a problem nonetheless. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, they kind of talk about missing plastic. They say something like a very small amount, maybe only 1% of the plastic that we produce or throw away is accounted for because this plastic tends to sink. They don't really know where it ends up. And they found plastic in even the deepest part of the ocean in the Mariana Trench. And so here's just kind of a summary of some research done. You can see the different locations where they found these microplastics. And again, you can see the units are kind of different for every project because there's no agreed upon sampling method. And so when these microplastics enter the ocean, there are some molecular changes. A biofilm forms, which I'm going to talk about a little later, and it plays a role in the microplastic being negatively charged. But if the pH was less than 3, these microplastics would be positively charged. But since the pH of the ocean is around 8.1, these microplastics are negatively charged. So here on the right, we see an infographic. We see either secondary, primary microplastics, they enter, they're discolored, their surface changes, they can even be reduced further, their crystallinity changes, which has to do with polymer, and then the biofilm growth is increased, and that plays a role in density. So there are chemicals in microplastics because they are polymers. They're added during the production process. So they have flame retardants, plasticizers, phthalates. Those big studies are being done on those to be endocrine disruptors with development and young children being exposed to these at high amount. There's also chemicals unintentionally added during the production process, which essentially happens to anything we're consuming. And specifically in plastics, it's vinyl chloride, BPA. And then in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the chemicals adsorbed from environmental pollution or just earth sources such as heavy metals, organic compounds, and even some biological antibiotic resistant bacteria. And all of these origins have the potential for release when ingested by species and reaching the gut. So here's kind of a big summary of the problem. We see these plastics are made, they end up in the ocean. Microbes colonize the plastic fragments, contribute to the biofilm, they're eaten by plankton, and then fish consume it, or even mollusks, shellfish, and then we go on to consume these animals if we eat sea fish, or even sea salt could be a problem in this. So now I'm going to talk about the plastic biofilm because this changes the surface of the microplastics, and this is kind of ocean specific. We see microplastics in other places. They can be through the air, they can be in sediment in rivers, but this is a big deal in the ocean, the biofilm formation, and it forms upon contact with water through adsorption. And it includes a community of bacteria, algae, protozoans, and fungi. So they're attached to these extracellular polymeric substances, and they're composed of polysaccharides, proteins, and DNA. And this biofilm growth may promote the formation of hydrous oxides and active binding sites for metals. They form organometallic complexes with metal ions, and it makes it possible to remove metals in the process of separation from bioabsorption. So some changes, as I mentioned earlier, there's an increase in density. The diffusion coefficient decreases by a magnitude of 4, and it also protects from UV degradation. So they're not sure kind of the long-term effects on what a biofilm would have effect on plastic degradation. And then biofilms also enhance the role of microplastics in the transport of trace metals such as nickel, copper, zinc, and cadmium. So a really important thing to talk about is adsorption versus absorption. So you see here for adsorption, it's kind of like sticking to the surface like this pie, versus absorption. It would be when you eat the pie or kind of like a sponge when it actually goes inside. And so microplastics adsorb, so it's on the surface. And they hold molecules as a thin film or on internal surfaces within the material. See, as the weathering process occurs, there's kind of these grooves that can form within the microplastics, and that can contribute to adsorption. And they can absorb organic pollutants 2 to 6 times higher than that of sediment like sand, because animals do eat rocks, sand, even we do at times on accident. But the problem with these microplastics is that they have a much higher affinity than these other substances to absorb toxic things, as well as they are made of some toxic components. And these absorption affinity depends on a variety of dynamic factors, polymer type, what it is absorbing, and strongly absorbed molecules are characterized as slowly desorbing or even desorption resistant. So here's an outline of the factors affecting absorption. We have some environmental factors, such as weathering, which occurs, surface roughness, the pH, the salinity, biofilm formation, which depends on what's available in the water, and then microplastic dependent, which is dependent mostly on the polymers, such as crystallinity, some kinetic factors, even the color has been shown to have some effects, and then the polymer type. So now I'm going to talk about heavy metals, and I just want to give a background on heavy metal toxicity and why they're bad for us. So arsenic, cadmium, chromium, lead, and mercury rank among the priority metals that are of public health significance. They can induce organ damage, and they are classified as carcinogens. This is a big public health crisis. We don't want these things in our water, in our food, and we definitely don't want them in microplastics or the ocean. So heavy metals enter the sea usually through a riverine influx after weathering or erosion of rocks or even erosion of pipes. And there's some naturally occurring in the atmosphere, like from volcanoes, and then sometimes human activities when we burn stuff or other things. And then the main mechanism of heavy metal toxicity, and by that I mean the way in which they cause problems, is generation of free radicals to cause oxidative stress. So basically, when they cross the cell membrane, they generate a bunch of free radicals, and then your cell is kind of in shock, and it can't go around normal cellular function because it's trying to get rid of these free radicals, and through that it ends up being damaged. So now for heavy metals and microplastics. Like I mentioned before, they're present in the natural environment and from anthropogenic sources, which means human sources, and they're non-degradable and recycled. So these heavy metals will always be there. And some studies have shown that heavy metals have been found on microplastics from the North Atlantic subtropical gyre, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and then beaches in Southwest England and Western Europe. So pretty much everywhere these heavy metals are being found to adsorb to microplastics. And a big thing with microplastics, since they're so small, I know this is a big concept in biology, the large surface area to volume, they can act like magnets, and they can accumulate a really high concentration within this small little sphere or fiber. And heavy metals also play an important biological role. They can serve as carbon sources for microbial growth on the biofilm. And they have also been shown, this is a new thing, to increase antibiotic resistant genes through co-selection. So that's a whole nother factor. And what they're saying is the microplastics as of now, based on the research they've done, aren't as harmful to the organisms as the heavy metals that attach and could be desorbed or released to the animal and cause oxidative stress. And so this is kind of tying in the microbiology approach with the heavy metals. You see through different reactions, these heavy metals can facilitate biofilm growth, or they're promoted to go in the biofilm. So microplastic is definitely a favorable environment because it helps these heavy metals help the biofilm grow. And we see even here, they say heavy metals are tolerant or resistant to microbes. And so here there are some of the models. This is a lot of basic chemistry. Here we see electrostatic attraction, the negatively charged surface attracts positive, some partition effect, which isn't as common because this would be more of an adsorption, some basic halogen bonding, van der Waals forces, and hydrogen bonding. And here we see the interaction on the outside, like temperature, pH, ionic strength. And this is just a good summary of the different things that affect, as well as the different models proposed, but it's mostly going to be electrostatic attraction and repulsion. So for electrostatic attraction, these divalent metals, some of them can interact with some carboxylate anions on the surface of the microplastics through electrostatic attraction, and it's the primary mechanism through which these metals attract. You see the negatively charged surface attracts the positively charged metals, very simple. And here we see some different models proposed for different types of molecules. Another factor that affects adsorption would be the crystallinity of the polymer. So there's, on the right, you can see there's 4 common microplastics with the structures, glass transition temperature, and crystallinity. So there's something called these amorphous regions, and they're basically characterized by being a more disordered chain, and these essentially more disorder favors adsorption. And then when the temperature is higher than the glass transition temperature, the physical form of the polymer transforms from glassy to rubbery. And then when the polymer is in the rubbery state, sorption is higher because there's a higher degree of freedom to move, and they have a higher diffusion coefficient. And so now for the effects of weathering. Weathering also causes higher adsorption, and it also creates oxygen-containing functional groups. And that increases polarity, porosity, hydrophilicity, and as well as the negative charges and the surface area. So you see here on the bottom, once the microplastic is weathered, there's essentially more grooves, and those more grooves create a greater surface area. So with that, you're going to see a greater adsorption of pretty much anything positively charged. And so now for pH effects. Increasing pH values higher sorption capacities of metal cations such as lead, cadmium, nickel, and cobalt, and that's due to the decreased relative abundance of free ions. So when you have a higher pH, it's going to be more basic, make the plastic more negative because there's not as much hydrogen ions. But however, they've noticed that with increasing pH sorption of chromium, there is a decrease because chromium mostly occurs with it becomes negatively charged through the addition of oxygen or hydrogen to form a compound. And here's just kind of a good example. I know this is from flax fibers, but you see as there's hydrogen, as the pH goes up, there's less hydrogen, and basically there's more sites for it, but it reaches kind of like a threshold where it's not as favored. And so salinity, because we're talking about the ocean. The adsorption capacity of cadmium, nickel, and cobalt are decreased with the increase of salinity, but chromium, as we know, chromium has an exception because it combines with oxygen or hydrogen, absorption is increased. And this is because of the competition of sodium for adsorption sites and the decrease of the electrostatic interactions, kind of what we saw with the pH scale. As it gets too high, although they're independent, the sodium goes to bind, so it kind of competes. And so the effects of salinity can be attributed to the increasing salinity disrupts the charge equilibrium and neutralizes the surface area of the adsorbent, which may impede the electrostatic interaction. So basically, because the sodium is positive and the microplastics negative, it kind of neutralizes it and makes it less negative, which is not favorable for adsorption. And higher salinity may strongly compete for cationic sorption sites of sorbents and decrease the activity of charged ions. And then the compression of the electrical double layer promotes the formation of a denser aggregation structure. And so here's another summary. This is definitely a growing area of research, and you see that hydrophilic and hydrophobic, although they're different, they have the same affinity for polyethylene. So this just kind of shows how complex of an issue this is due to environmental factors, due to polymer type and all sorts of things. And there's not really going to be one answer, but understanding kind of trends or what's out there, or trying to even mimic these in a lab, because it's really hard sometimes to study things in the open ocean, is just important because the technological implications it could have. And so here we see all different types of things. This table doesn't just include heavy metals. So on the left, we have the polymer type. And in the middle, we have what's being absorbed. And we see there's antibiotics, cadmium, a heavy metal, benzene derivatives, carcinogens, and all sorts of things have been studied to absorb to these microplastics, even within a bunch of different polymer types that aren't as common. And so this is just a summary. I know it's a lot and a lot of different things about the properties of the microplastics and how it helps adsorption capacity. So we see as size surface area increases, so does absorption. As aging happens, as weathering happens, that causes the surface area to increase. So it's a positive adsorption, but we see as the hydrophilicity increases, it can have negative for certain organic compounds. And as crystallinity increases, it has a negative adsorption. But as the functional groups increase, such as the carbonyl groups, it allows for a favor in different types of bonding. So now to kind of summarize a big picture view, some potential problems with these microplastics. So animals who ingest these microplastics, they have a diminished urge to eat. So they can get trapped in the gut even without these toxic hitchhikers, as I like to call them. So the animal eats this, it gets trapped in the gut, and then they feel like they're full, so then they don't have to eat. They have even been found in the guts of benthic eaters, and benthic eaters are animals on the ocean seafloor. And this is really important because the ocean seafloor does have a really great impact on the ecosystem, surprisingly. And the fact that they're finding these in the really deep parts of the ocean just kind of indicates how much of a problem this is and how these microplastics are sinking and accumulating in the sediment in amounts we probably don't even know of. So some of the potentially ingested toxins highlighted in this presentations are PAHs, carcinogens, organic pesticides, endocrine disruptors such as phthalates, and heavy metals. And then we go on to eat these animals. And this infographic, it kind of shows through these green marks, pollutants that absorb to these microplastics. And we see plankton can eat it, which is kind of the basis of the food chain, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer, and it just kind of bioaccumulates. And so we know like certain fish should not be eaten by a pregnant woman due to high amounts of mercury. So this may be a future problem that certain fish with higher up in the food chain shouldn't be eaten because they're accumulating these microplastics with these toxic pollutants in much higher amount, although there's no mechanism for desorption of the toxic pollutants yet. And so here we see a model animal. Because these haven't really been studied in humans yet, but they have been studied in fish. You see the brain neurotoxicity, enzyme dysregulation, again, we see oxidative damage. From the kidney, we see blockage, problems with reproduction, and then in the stomach, intestinal blockage, again, organ damage, inflammation, and problems with growth. And model animals are really useful to us because that's kind of how I think we've tested most of our carcinogens. We say it's suspected carcinogen through the use of model animals. So we imagine if it's harmful to the fish, it is most likely going to be harmful for us, although we can't say with 100% certainty until it is tested or observed in nature. And then here's just a chart highlighting the research done on different animals. We see bivalves, zooplankton, and these are all where microplastics have been found with these contaminants. We see trislosin, silver, and other things. And aves are birds. So actually a lot of studies have been done on coastal birds ingesting microplastics because I guess they're easier to study since oftentimes they end up on land and not in the ocean. And so just because that was a lot of words to show you guys some pictures, some plankton, zebrafish, bivalve, and then birds, which are actually playing a big role in the studies nowadays, especially kind of in colder areas where they're studying. So now to talk about how it affects us as humans. So they're saying that the average American eats, drinks, and breathes in more than 74,000 microplastic particles each year. So these microplastics aren't only in the ocean, although that's kind of what I focused on. They're definitely in sediments, in rivers, even in the air. And I wanted to focus on the ocean because I think that has a really big impact on our ecosystem, and it does cover most of the world, most of our Earth's surface. So that's why I think it's very important and going to be super important in the upcoming years for research. And they say 25% of fish, although it's probably underestimated, have ingested plastic in some form or another. And so even if you are vegetarian, this could still be a problem because microplastics are being found in sea salts, in 90% of sea salt, which is really crazy to me. And studies have reported the presence of mainly PET and PP microplastics in 8 human stool samples. So it's kind of ending up everywhere, even though we don't know its specific effects. We only can go based off model animals. And so there's a lack of studies regarding direct clinical consequences on the human bodies. But based on some studies on model organisms, we're assuming it will not be too good. And so some specific health hazards. If the microplastics are smaller than 0.1 micrometers, they can cross your cell membranes. That has been shown. And then they're saying the next step is going to be nanoplastics, even smaller. And they may be able to cross your brain barrier and even placenta. And like I mentioned earlier, they cause oxidative stress. Here's a good diagram of oxidative stress caused by cells being attacked by the free radicals. And that causes cytokines to be released and DNA damage. And we're not sure the excretion and metabolic process yet. So we're not sure exactly where the microplastics end up when they end up in your body. It'll probably depend on size, surface area, and a lot of other things. And it's also important to note that since it is in the ocean, a lot of these testings for adsorption are done in the laboratory and then compared to results in the ocean. So there's not, in the lab is always going to differ from in the field. So there's no super concrete data yet, as this is a very new, you probably noticed a lot of the articles I showed, nothing was really older than 2015 from all that. So all that's been done kind of in the last 6-7 years. And so for some future work, because this is definitely a growing field, microplastics, and specifically in the ocean, the amount of microplastics is very likely underestimated because there's no agreed upon sampling method. So meetings with scientists about establishing a sampling method is probably within the near future. But understanding how these microplastics interact, they can allow for new mechanisms of membrane filtration to be implemented, which could serve as a possible cleanup method. And then for a public policy standpoint, there's no water criteria yet for microplastic related pollution from contaminants, since we don't know much about it. So as we learn more, there's some policy reform that will probably need to go into place. And then this has always been talk, working to create an ideal environmentally friendly plastic that doesn't have these problems or doesn't take 1,000 years to degrade. And since these microplastics, to end on something kind of positive, since these microplastics can absorb environmental pollutants, they could possibly adsorb already ingested pollutants in your body potentially, or even heavy metals within the environment. So maybe they could serve as a cleanup since they have such a high affinity for all these heavy metals and toxins. And like I mentioned earlier, the next step is going to be nanoplastics, and they have been shown to be able to permeate the cell membrane. So kind of a call to action, a movement to a more sustainable future. This is going to talk about a couple different industries or standpoints. So one thing could be alternative plastics, although a lot of people argue that this is not the answer. They're focused more on the waste industry. But the Agricultural Research Services, there's a patent right now for a method to turn milk protein into water-resistant films. And then Saltwater Brewery has created the first ever edible 6-pack beer ring made of barley and wheat ribbons. So when they're released into the ocean, any animal who comes into contact with it could eat it. Because I remember growing up, those 6 ring packs, seeing those pictures of turtles on the TV, they get caught in it and then they grow and then they end up deformed. So that was a big thing, making sure to cut up your any plastic products that animals could get caught in. And so another thing, kind of more consumer focused, I guess, is limiting waste and living more sustainably. So limit the purchase of synthetic clothing. So fast fashion is a huge industry right now. And I guess I didn't realize the environmental implications it had until doing some research on it. So fast fashion websites, buying shirts for like $5 made out of cheap material that are probably going to last a couple uses, maybe limiting that. And there are these nets you can buy when washing your products to avoid some microplastic transfer. And as well, they're working on this sort of filter. It's in the early stages. It's very expensive right now to capture these microplastics before they're released into the water. And then avoiding single-use plastics like water bottles and plastic bags. But a big thing is kind of holding industries accountable, policy reform, which could be hard kind of in a capitalistic society, but definitely the fashion industry, the waste treatment industry, there's kind of, I guess, big drama in that with getting around certain things. The car industry, as of now, we need cars, but who knows in the future, maybe we won't need cars. And then most importantly, the people who kind of control it all, the governments. And so I know one of our themes for Environmental Fridays is it's personal. So I kind of wanted to talk about our role. So as consumers and as scientists, because I think most of us are scientists or are getting into some science field. So this is just something very easy, apparently. Washing habits, a lower temperature is better, using liquid detergent instead of powder, and then again, using some sort of net on the outside to capture these fragments so they don't end up in our water. And then shopping more sustainably is a big thing when you go out, or at least I know when I go out, I'm like, do I really need this? Is this really going to last me that long? Or avoiding synthetic fabrics when possible, because they are kind of actually bad for your skin. So that could be another health thing. And then definitely avoiding single-use plastics. I know there was a big thing with eliminating straws and just using tote bags or water bottles that are reusable. And so as scientists, I think a reason why we have these Environmental Fridays, a big benefit of this is staying educated. So careful not to get tricked by the industries and hold them accountable. Because through doing my research, I thought that beauty products were the biggest problem to plastic pollution or microbeads in the ocean. But then doing the research, it's a very small portion. And although it is good that that problem was fixed, we see that the fashion industry is kind of a bigger thing, but that's such a huge industry. I think that a lot of light hasn't been brought to it because it could have some really big economic implications. So just staying educated on different things and not falling into sort of fads that the media has to make environmental sustainability trendy. And then innovation. So as we go about our lives, whether we end up in any field of science, there's always going to be a way to be environmentally conscious, even through organic synthesis, inventing new things, and just kind of keeping this, I guess, big picture goal in mind when you're developing something and how it's going to affect the planet, because this is where we live, and this is an important part of being a good scientist, is protecting the earth. And I just want to say special thanks to Andrews for helping me as I'm about to graduate. And then the members of Chem 418, they helped critique this presentation, and Dr. Murray. And here are my references.
Good. Very good. Hannah, you have a few minutes still.
Yeah,
So you could go ahead and thank your best friend and ask questions.
yeah, so Emma's a really good friend of mine. We're actually roommates right now. We've been in the same program for all 4 years, and I know how capable she is. She worked really hard on this presentation. She's a very well-informed scientist. So I would love to open the floor for any questions that anyone has regarding Emma's presentation. You can write them in the chat and I can read them out loud, or you can unmute and go ahead and ask her directly.
Okay, so I could ask a question. I was intrigued for most of the presentation about whether a diet based on plants would be one way of, like, avoiding these microplastics, but then you had a slide that says, oh, well, it's in the air, it's everywhere. So, okay, but still, there seems to be a part that we could do in terms of diet, right? Just based on what you said, based on the cycles, it looks like a plant-based diet. Are there any examples of, like, plant-based foods also containing microplastics? Is that type of information out there?
Not that I've seen. I know they talk about microplastics in agriculture a lot, actually, like in soil, but I'm not sure necessarily about the plants. I do think kind of eating a more plant-based diet would probably help the environment overall, because a lot of waste, at least, like, maybe not specifically ocean waste, but land waste. I know the meat industry, dairy industry contributes to a lot of pollution, maybe not on a microplastic scale, but that documentary on Netflix that I was talking about, the Seaspiracy, that one, their call was essentially to not eat any animal products, because they said the fishing industry was the problem with the ocean. And it's probably not the main problem, but it is like 10%, so that's definitely a thing.
Yeah. Anybody else has questions for Emma? You guys could unmute and ask a question.
I actually have a question for Emma. So I noticed when you said that most of the microplastics do sink to the bottom of the ocean, that's a completely different environment than what we're used to having plastics in, like an open atmosphere. So I was wondering if you know any of the main differences between the degradation process of plastics in the bottom of the ocean versus in the open atmosphere?
Well, I would say because, so none of the plastic that we've made to this day has been really degraded yet. So that's kind of a tricky question, but I would say since it's at the bottom, there's less UV light. It's going to be colder, so it's less likely to split into like even smaller and smaller pieces. It's more likely to be eaten and then kind of uptaken to higher levels. But yeah, that's a good question, because I feel like it would probably take longer to degrade at the bottom of the ocean since it's so cold, unless you're next to like a vent or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been trying since I've started Environmental Fridays to get a speaker on the impact of the fashion industry.
Mm.
And I haven't been successful yet. I wonder why.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, we're all guilty of
Yeah,
overshopping.
because what I've been reading is that, I mean, if we want to think about a major culprit in terms of this stuff, the fashion industry is one. And so it'd be really interesting for us to have a full-blown lecture on that and, you know, wrap our minds around what's going on and what we could do as consumers. I mean, we want clothes. What we can do, however, as consumers to help alleviate this problem. It's not just microplastics. It's like in many third world, so-called third world countries, you see piles and piles and piles in landfills of, you know, of clothing and fabric. So, yeah. Anybody else has comments, questions?
Yeah, something that caught my attention is that, is it 80 or 90% of sea salt, of all sea salt,
Yes.
microplastics?
Oh my gosh.
So I was thinking myself that, oh, if you live on a plant-based diet, then, you know, you're pretty much helping yourself a lot. But was there any suggestion of, were there any other kinds of salt flavoring that were possible substitutes?
Mm-hmm.
Because most of the cooking salt that we use come from the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So was there any suggestion?
Not that I saw. Yeah, I mean, I guess specifically this like sea salt because it's in an ocean environment, but no, I didn't see any kind of substitutes. I'd have to look into that. Yeah.
Or is there a process that can be used when the salt is extracted to eliminate the plastics? Because I imagine what's happening is it's being caught in the crystals when the crystallization is done. Or is it in the crystals, or is it just with the crystals? Do you know?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, especially because we even like those grinder salt things, I know that's what I use. I'm assuming even plastic can get in from that, like when you grind the salt too, it just kind of separates everything. So yeah, I'd have to look more into that.
So maybe one experiment we could try is like one of the first experiments we do in introducing students to chemistry, which is we could take the sea salt, the salt, dissolve it in water, make sure it's completely dissolved, maybe warm water, and then evaporate out the water or distill it over, or however you want to collect it. And what remains, because the plastics should not be, you know, dissolved in the water. Yeah, right. So that could be a way of separating it if, I don't know, like, do this,
it's just that I'm
home.
Sure.
Do this at home.
I'm sure if they purify the salt that much, they're going to increase the price 10 times. But that caught my attention, and I was surprised by that too.
Yep, it did. Yep. All right. So I think this was a really good eye-opening presentation as well. We want to really thank my student, who I'm very proud of, Emma. She's actually one of my teaching assistants for organic chemistry. So she's a great student. And want to thank our audience, as usual, for showing up. And we hope that you got something out of this that you could, you know, at least consider and maybe make some changes, or at least advocate for some changes. Thank you, Emma. Thank you all. Next week, we will continue with Environmental Fridays. It is personal. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Very, very good presentation.
Thank you.
And very well presented.
Yes, yes. Told you she's
Thank
one of
you.
my best students.
Yeah, she has a good grasp of the concepts.
Yep, she does. All right, take care.
Have a good day, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.